All right, everyone, we'll get started. All right, so welcome to the second lecture on the Commonwealth EPBC Act. So today we'll complete our discussion of the EPBC Act. Last week we looked at the main provisions that govern the referral process, how we decide what a controlled action is, the assessment processes that apply under the EPBC Act, and the use of bilateral agreements in terms of how it then interacts with the Queensland EIS process. Today we will look once again at the issue of Commonwealth and state laws, and we'll look at it in terms of looking at the case study of the Tasmanian Dam Case. We're also going to look at, very briefly, how the precautionary principle has been interpreted in Australia, and how the law uses scientific uncertainty in making decisions. And then finally we will look at the lungfish case study, which is the Paradise Dam case study, and we'll look at the issues when conditions of approval are imposed on a project under the EPBC Act, and the issues that we see occurring in terms of enforcement of those conditions of approval. But before we do that, I wanted to have a quick chat about sort of where we're up to in the course. So one of the things you need to remember that there's a lot of strategy that you need to bring with you in a course like this. So you need to be strategic about how you're spending your time, what you're studying, how you're organising your notes, and what your game plan is going into the exam. I know that for a lot of you an open book exam is a very strange concept, and so we'll talk about that a bit more this morning. One of the probably quite critical things to remember is this is one of those courses where we continue to deliver quite vital information between now and the exam. So it's not one of those courses that just tapers off and all the tough stuff is already done before you get to the exam. There's quite a few important topics that you'll see a number of questions on in the exam. So not only that, but the idea is that we're bringing together all those key concepts that we started way back at the beginning when we were looking at IDAS and the Sustainable Planning Act and so on, as well as pulling it in to help you understand how you will use that in a professional setting. When we look at the EPBC Act, do keep it in perspective. So most development applications that we see are going to be dealt with under state and territory planning laws. There's only a very small proportion that end up being referred under the EPBC Act each year. So, you know, maybe 100 to 400 referrals compared to more than 250,000 development applications across Australia. So just keep that in mind. You know, obviously it depends what sort of practice you go into. The practice that I ended up going into, all of my work was the EPBC Act, because that's when they needed the lawyers to come in and help them out. So, you know, for me, it was very rare for me to see an application that didn't involve the EPBC Act. This is just to remind you where we're up to in terms of our schedule. So we're up to week 10, which is where the little star is. So we're doing the EPBC Act case studies this week. Those of you that have had your prac this week, we looked at the enforcement guidelines. And then the prac for next week, we're going to do the 2012 past exam paper. The following week, we'll do the coal seam gas land access code, and we'll look at it from the point of view of professional duties and conflicts. And then in the final prac in week 13, we'll do the 2014 practice exam paper. And we'll have a wrap-up lecture in week 13 where I'll go through and give an overview of each of the topics, and we'll have an open question and answer session where you can come and ask whatever queries you might have in terms of needing clarification. So for the EPBC Act, just remember, although projects are very rarely refused under the EPBC Act, it does play an important role. It does keep a check on large state infrastructure projects by requiring them to go through this additional hurdle in terms of requiring both approval, but also the fact that they're being assessed by a different regulatory body. So it's another form of oversight, and it does increase the level of scrutiny that we see on these projects. So do keep that in mind. It does play an important role. End of semester exam. This is all things that we talked about way back at the beginning, but I've had a lot of questions about it, so I thought I would put the slide back up again for you. So for the undergrad course, you're going to have open book, 2 hours plus 10 minutes perusal, and it's going to be 10 multiple choice, 5 short answer, and 1 essay question. So when you do the 2012 practice exam next week, you'll see there were 6 short answer questions, and the essay question was worth less marks. And in order to give people more time in answering the questions, we've dropped one of the questions, so it's now down to 5 short answer, and the essay question is worth 5 more marks to make up for it. So it's 60%, and there's an exam hurdle there, so you need to get 40% on the final exam to receive a passing grade. You'll remember the exam info sheet is up on the Blackboard site, so make sure that you have a look at that. It gives you some great ideas on how to prepare and what to bring in. For postgrads, you get the same amount of time, but you get a different approach in terms of the types of questions that you have. So you're going to have 4 short answer questions, and then 2 essay questions that you choose from a choice of 3. And same exam hurdle applies. So you need to achieve at least 40% on the final exam. And again, just want to draw postgrads your attention to the info sheet that's on the Blackboard side as well, which explains the type of questions you'll expect, what type of topics they would be on, and again, the best approach for answering the questions. So how should you prepare for the exam? Starting point, make sure you're reviewing the slides for each lecture. I know that a lot of you haven't been printing the slides, and it's really quite important that you've got those slides printed with you. One of the things that I've done this semester is I've included those screenshots of the legislation for you, so that you didn't have to go to the legislation every week and find those sections of the Act for yourself. But that means that you need to have printed those things and have them with you. You can ignore any slides that have got photos or images, things that were there for background information on the case studies. You don't need to print those. Just make sure you've got the ones where I'm summarising the legislation, or I'm explaining how it works, and the ones where I've got the screenshots of those things as well, because they'll be very useful to you. Any time that I've said, make sure you print out these sections, or make sure you print out these policy documents. Make sure you print them out, and of course you're going to need those handouts. Now, although that all sounds like a lot of printing, you've just got to compare that to the cost of buying an environmental law textbook, which would be in the hundreds of dollars. So this is definitely a much more cost-effective way of going down that path, and that's why we don't make you go and buy one of the huge sort of 600-page environmental law textbooks for these courses. So make sure you do that, and then of course it's what you do with the material that helps you in the exam. So be organised. Make sure you've got your 1 to 2 page summary sheet at the front of each topic. Organise the materials behind it. You can use sticky notepads, you can highlight, you can write in the margins. You can very much make the materials work for you. The only thing you're not allowed to do is bring in electronic items. So if it's printed, you can bring it in, and you can, refer to it. You need to be familiar with the material you're bringing in. There's no point bringing in a clean, pristine copy of all the printed material and saying, aha, I'm sorted, and popping it down on your desk, because you won't be able to find anything in there if you're not familiar with where all these things are. But remember, you don't need to learn it by heart. That's why it's an open book exam. Okay? Make sure you're going to practice completing the past papers using your printed material, so you'll get used to rifling through it and working out where all the bits and pieces are. And again, I've said this a few times, but make sure you're using pen and paper when you practice, because that's what you'll be doing in the exam. If you're looking for some instant feedback in terms of working out what your answers are looking like in terms of are they correct or incorrect. Do the quizzes on the Blackboard site. So they're going to give you instant answers on whether or not you've fully understood IDAS and the planning scheme and all those aspects that you're going to see on the end of semester exam. So there's 2 quizzes there. Make sure you've done those. And of course, make sure you're coming along to the weekly tutes. We're not going to repeat them again before the end of semester, so make the most of the learning activities while they're there. You'll remember last week I referred you to certain sections of the EPBC Act. Now, the reason that I did that is you may not have had a chance to read it yet, but the handout that you were given last week goes through and shows you all the different sections of the EPBC Act that you need, and sort of explains the approval process, the referral process, the assessment process. So it's a wonderful summary document that Chris McGrath put together, but it's designed to help you then navigate the EPBC Act and understand what the EPBC Act has to say. So, you know, make sure that you do understand the processes and the approval processes that apply. Why do you need to know them? Well, it's going to be in the essay question. So there'll be an essay question all about approving major projects. You'll see that when you do the past exam papers, there's a pattern that emerges over the past exam papers. So you need to understand how the assessment and the approval process is applied to major projects. You need to know the EPBC Act, the Sustainable Planning Act, and potentially you might be looking at the Environmental Protection Act or the State Development Public Works Act and so on. So you need to have a good understanding of those. There's been handouts given to you on how all those processes apply. You need to know what rights there are to object and challenge the projects, whether developers can get special treatment for their projects. So we've talked about coordinated projects and so on. You know, if you don't know where to start with that, go back and review the slides, read the handouts, and then from there you can form an outline on what your model answer should look at. And again, look at those past exam papers. The final exam is going to be similar in format. Obviously, the facts are going to be different. But you can have your model answer that you've worked on. You can work on it in groups if you find it's easier to pool your resources. You can form study groups and work together to come up with the best understanding of how does IDAS work, how does the EPBC Act work, and so on. And then when you get into the exam, you modify it to apply it to the facts that you're given in the exam. One of the mistakes that people often make in the exam is they get confused and they think that the referral process under the EPBC Act is part of the information and referral stage under the Sustainable Planning Act, which is the whole IDAS process. They're separate. Although they both use the word referral in them, they are completely separate systems, so don't get confused. So you have your referral under the EPBC Act, and that's different to the information and referral stage under the Sustainable Planning Act. Given that you're going to be looking at your past exam papers sometime between now and the tutes next week, I thought it was probably quite important to show you how your exams are going to be assessed. Because it's an open book exam, it means we're not testing you on memory. Okay, so you telling me the correct answer is not going to be a 7 because it's not closed book, right? So if you look at the grade of 4 there, it's small, but this has come out of the ECP if you want to go and look at it more closely. But a grade of 4, that's a pass. So it demonstrates adequate understanding and application of the fundamental concepts of the field of study, develops routine arguments or decisions, provides acceptable justification, communicates information and ideas adequately in terms of the conventions of the discipline. Okay, so an adequate understanding and application of the fundamental concepts would be the material that we've delivered to you in the lectures, the practicals, the things you've covered in the group assignment and so on. Okay, so that would be, if you gave me that in your answer, that's a pass. Okay? So it's reasonably easy for you to get 50% of the marks in each question, and then it becomes more difficult as you go up the scale. And I'll let you guys have a look at that in your own time, but you can see it explains there what a 5, what a 6, what a 7 would be, and that gets applied as we mark each question. Again, we'll talk about that more when we do the pracs, but I thought it was useful to put it up now so everyone can start thinking along those lines. So a 7, just to put it in context for you, you would be providing consistent evidence of substantial originality and insight in identifying, generating, and communicating competing arguments, perspectives, or problem-solving approaches, critically evaluating the problems, their solutions, and the implications. Okay, so a quick refresh from last week. So what did we cover? First of all, we looked at what are matters of national environmental significance. So we said, is it likely to have a significant impact on a matter of national environmental significance? That's the question that you need to ask. If so, then there's an obligation to refer that to the minister. How do you know whether it's going to have a significant impact? One of the things you need to remember is that can include indirect impacts. So it can include the downstream and the cumulative impacts from the project. What's the method of assessment? We looked at that last week. There was a broad range of things that could be covered, all the way from a decision on preliminary documentation all the way up to a public inquiry. But you can also be covered by an assessment bilateral agreement with Queensland. And what happens if it's going to be approved? Well, the minister makes that final decision whether to approve or refuse, and they can also impose conditions of approval to mitigate the impacts. And we'll look at that today when we look at the Paradise Dams case study in terms of the minister imposing conditions of approval to mitigate the impacts on the lungfish. And we can sort of look at whether or not that was effective in mitigating the impacts. So first of all, I wanted to look at the Tasmanian Dam Case. So I'll just show you the very beginning of the documentary that was put on this, just to give you a bit of context.
The Franklin River flows through a remote wilderness in the southwest corner of Tasmania. For thousands of years, it had remained untouched. In the early 1980s, the Franklin became known to millions of Australians. The Tasmanian government had plans to dam the river. It was to be part of a massive hydroelectric scheme. But in 1983, these plans came to an abrupt halt. The High Court of Australia stopped the project after the biggest environmental battle Australians had ever seen. The fight for the Franklin would be a turning point for Australia's conservation movement. Preserving the environment became a national cause. The fight over the Franklin River was between two groups with very different opinions, the conservation movement and the Tasmanian government. While the government planned to dam the river for a hydroelectric scheme, the conservationists wanted the Franklin to remain undeveloped, and both sides strongly believed they were right. Let's take a closer look at the two groups. What caused their dramatic confrontation on the river, and how had this conflict of values come about?
Look at more of that in your own time if you want to, but it's just to give you an idea of what the Franklin River looked like before I start taking you into these images. So this is the Franklin River, and the unusual thing about this scenario is that is not so much the fact that there was an environmental group that wanted to preserve the Franklin, but that they succeeded in preserving the Franklin River. And they did so with the help of the federal government. That's what makes this a very unusual case study. So you can see the images are stunning. And they wanted to, this is Basin. For those of you who don't know, Tasmania is hidden down the bottom here where that red circle is. That's Tasmania, and there's the location of the proposed dam. And it's right near to that Gordon River. So there was the Gordon River Dam that was constructed back in the 1960s to 1970s, and then they wanted to put in a new dam for the Franklin River. So you can see you've got the Franklin River flowing south, the Gordon River flowing west, and it was called the Gordon Below Franklin Dam that they were going to put in there for their hydroelectric scheme. So there it is there. You can see it's close to the intersection of the Franklin and the Gordon River. So this is the map that shows the location of the proposed dam and in the context of the flow of the river. And this is a signed photograph of the case is so significant in environmental law, they've got signed photographs around the place. So you can see this is the beginning of construction for these things. So you can see there's a lot of clearing going on and construction and just a great deal of interference. These aren't small-scale infrastructure developments. They have a very large impact on the area. You know, the tree felling and the damming and so on. It's quite brutal, and it's definitely significant in terms of impacts. Now, the Tasmanian government was quite determined that it was going to go ahead, and the environmental groups were quite determined it was not going to go ahead. And so it was a very bitter and quite aggressive battle that was going on between the two. And this is an image here of the Gordon River forest. So that's the Gordon River Dam, the previous one I was telling you about. You can see it's epic. Again, we're not talking about small-scale impacts on the area here. It's very significant. And the Tasmanian government wanted to build a second one. These are the protesters back in the 1980s. And this is very, very much regarded as the beginning of the environmental movement in Australia. This was the beginning of environmental law and the beginning of environmentalists actually having success in terms of how they protected vulnerable areas. And this was the demonstrations that went around in the cities as well. So although there were people out on the rivers trying to physically stop these developments from going ahead, the city folk were getting involved too and doing their bit. And really calling on the government, the federal government, to get involved and stop the dam from going ahead. And it says, could you vote for a party that would destroy this? Vote for the Franklin. And this was an ad put in by the Wilderness Society. And this is where it was all decided. So that's the High Court of Australia there, after they'd handed down their decision. And what did they have to decide? Well, they were looking at whether or not the Commonwealth had power to intervene and save the Franklin. So the Commonwealth had decided it would step in and it would pass legislation that would prevent the Tasmanian government from building the Franklin Dam. And the Tasmanian government challenged that, and they argued that the government did not have power to interfere in state environmental matters, that it was not one of the heads of power, which is what we call Section 51. Section 51 tells us what the Commonwealth's heads of power are, and it said, look, there's nothing there that says environment. And of course, what you hopefully all know by now is when our High Court decides that they want to put their thinking caps on, they do a very good job of interpreting our Constitution, and they decided that the external affairs power was broad enough to include all of Australia's international obligations under all these new environmental treaties that we had signed up to. And although there was no such thing as an environmental treaty when the Constitution was written, they decided that if you applied it to a modern setting, it would include all of these various international agreements. So they decided, across a series of cases, including the Tasmanian Dam Case, that under Section 51, the Commonwealth Government has power to enact legislation that is reasonably capable of being considered appropriate and adapted to fulfil Australia's international legal obligations. Okay, so it's broad enough so that the Commonwealth Government can pass laws to allow them to fulfil their international legal obligations. And that means, because of all their international legal obligations relating to the environment, it means the Commonwealth Government has a very wide power to make laws to protect the environment. And we looked at examples of international conventions last week. This is just another example again. This is the Biodiversity Convention Act. We looked at that last week. But you can see, if you look at Article 8, right down the bottom at subsection K, so it says each contracting party shall, as far as possible and appropriate, and then you go down to K, develop or maintain necessary legislation and or other regulatory provisions for the protection of threatened species and populations. So Australia has signed this, saying, yes, we will go and we will develop and maintain necessary legislation and regulatory provisions, and they were able to point to this to justify passing legislation that was then preventing the Tasmanian government from building the Franklin Dam because of the impact on these areas of biodiversity value. Now, what happens if we have a Commonwealth law that says you cannot do this, and we have a state law that says you can? The reality is we haven't really seen it. It's very rare, and normally what we have is these things operating side by side. So the EPBC Act operates side by side with the Queensland environmental legislation. They're not inconsistent, they just operate side by side. The only time we might hypothetically see something like this is if we have a Commonwealth legislation saying no nuclear plants, and we had a state act that allowed for nuclear power. But we haven't had any of that sort of scenario yet in Australia, so it's rare. But you do need to understand, for the purposes of the exam, that it's dealt with in the Constitution, so that's Section 109. So when a law of a state is inconsistent with the law of a Commonwealth, the Commonwealth prevails, okay? And it means that the state law will be invalid. So you just need to remember that for the exam. So I wanted to talk about how we reconcile community objections with scientific evidence, because what we have seen since Tasmanian dams is our communities are very good at getting revved up about environmental matters. I think we do it quite well, this indignation around developments and things like that. But it's not always supported by scientific evidence. And that's why we need to have a look at what the precautionary principle really asks us to do in terms of dealing with community objections. And I particularly want to look at it from the point of view of telecommunications towers. So we're not talking about areas where there is an actual impact on environmental species and so on. But it's different when we talk about telecommunications towers, because we're talking about impacts on humans. We're talking about fears and concerns of the community in terms of the electromagnetic radiation coming off of these things, concerns about visual impacts, concerns about impacts on property prices. And so there's been a whole series of cases where communities have attempted to have these banned in Australia. You quite often see local community centres. So, for example, areas where you can go and play bowling on the weekend, things like that. You know, those bowls clubs. There's quite a few of them around North Brisbane where they have these telecommunications towers on the roof. It's a way of them making extra money because the Telstra pays them to have these things installed on their roofs. But local communities, local property owners have raised objections in terms of the impacts on the amenity of the local area, and also fears about health impacts from them. So there was a court case known as the Telstra Corporation versus the Hornsby Shire Council. So Telstra Corporation had agreed to go and install this telecommunications equipment up on the roof of a recreational club. So it was another bowls club, something along those lines. They had agreed to lease their roof to Telstra Corporation for the equipment to go in. They were consenting to it, so the owners of the recreational club had no concerns. Hornsby Shire Council refused development consent to allow the telecommunications tower to be installed. And they refused because the community was objecting and saying they were concerned about electromagnetic radiation from the facility, impacts on health, impacts on safety. It was very much a fear campaign had gone through the local community. Now, the issue was that there are Australian standards that apply to these facilities. So there's an Australian standard that says this is a level of acceptable electromagnetic radiation. The emissions that were going to come off this equipment were going to comply with the Australian standards. And so Telstra appealed the decision on the basis that there wasn't really a legal basis for the council's refusal. So we need to remember what the precautionary approach is meant to be. So applying the precautionary principle, you need to have two conditions that are met. We call them conditions precedent, but you just need to know that there are two conditions that have to be met for the precautionary principle to apply. So first, there's got to be a threat of serious or irreversible environmental damage. And secondly, there has to be scientific uncertainty as to the environmental damage that will be caused. Okay? So you have to have both of those present before a decision maker that can then take a precautionary approach. And so the precautionary approach might be to take measures to avoid that threat. And those measures have to be proportionate to the threat that they think is there. Okay, so if you have those conditions there, so if there's a threat of serious or irreversible environmental damage and there's scientific uncertainty, then the decision maker must assume that the threat of serious or irreversible environmental damage is no longer uncertain but is a reality. So they have to say, okay, let's assume that this is actually going to happen, and then it's up to the person who wants the project approved, the proponent, to then demonstrate that actually that threat does not exist. So it just changes the way decisions are made. The issue in this case is that they were following the Australian standards. So the question was there in fact any scientific uncertainty? So it says, the precautionary principle, the whole point of it is that it allows you to take preventative measures without waiting for the reality of the risk to become fully known. So you don't wait for the species to be wiped out to take preventative measures to stop it from happening. You say, okay, there's a threat here, there's a serious threat, and there is scientific uncertainty about the nature of that threat. So let's assume that threat is real, and what steps should we be taking? Does that mean not approving the project at all? Does it mean approving the project with very stringent measures in place and so on? You can't use it to avoid all risks, so it's quite limited in its application. And whatever the response is, it's got to be appropriate to the degree of seriousness of the threat, and of course the amount of uncertainty. Yep.
When you say scientific confirmation,
Scientific uncertainty?
Uncertainty.
Yeah.
Can you clarify that? Do there need to be several studies to say make it uncertain, or like does the confirmation bias?
There's no calculation that's followed. No. So there's no set methodology for what makes scientific uncertainty present.
Does that make it difficult?
Yeah, that makes it difficult, yes. So in this case, it was all a little bit more clear-cut because the Australian standards are compiled across a number of bodies across Australia, and they're built on cumulative information. And so an Australian standard isn't adopted unless there's consensus across the community. So it was much easier to point to and say, look at the absence of scientific certainty.
Did DDT reach Australian standards?
DDT. But I'm talking about the electromagnetic radiation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just talking about the EMR Australian standards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the past, I'm just wondering if there are precedent cases where it was made uncertain. I don't know, like asbestos and DDT and all these things that we.
So It's only done at the point in time the decision is made. So hindsight's a fabulous thing. So at the point in time when the decision is made, if there's not scientific uncertainty, then you can't trigger the precautionary principle. Yeah. It's a good question, though, because if you would have seen I've been putting links up on the discussion board about news items about the toxic foam that was leaked from the airport, from the Commonwealth airport. And then there was a further news item I put up about on the Gold Coast where it was being, there were leaks from a Gold Coast facility of the same toxic material. Now we now know with hindsight that that material should not have been approved for use, but at the time it passed all the relevant standards, and so we would have said there was no scientific uncertainty. Yeah. So one of the things is we can't use the precautionary principle based on purely hypothetical approach to the risk. So they say it can't be based on mere speculation or mere conjecture. And in this case, that's pretty much what the local community was trying to do. So they were saying, look, hypothetically, there's a risk here, but they weren't able to point to any scientific studies to support their feeling as a community that there was a risk. So it was mere conjecture, it was speculation that there was a risk present here. And also, I've said before, it needs to be proportionate. So you know, if it's only a small amount of severity of the risk, a small amount of scientific uncertainty, you can't then use that to completely wipe out all potential development in that area, or to impose a requirement that costs, you know, multi-millions of dollars. So it's a balance between the cost and the practicality and the level of the threat. So it's a bit of a common sense approach that the courts are taking with the precautionary principle. If there's no scientific uncertainty, then you can't apply the precautionary principle. So in this case, the court came to the conclusion that there was no scientific uncertainty, which meant it just came down to, is there a threat of serious, irreversible environmental damage? And if so, are there measures that can be taken to prevent or to minimise that threat of serious or irreversible damage, which is just your normal decision-making process that you would see under the legislation. So you have to have scientific uncertainty in order to apply the precautionary principle. And one of the things that I've highlighted with you a few times is that we need to remember that things like the precautionary principle are just one part of the package of principles you need to consider. So the principles of ecologically sustainable development all have to be considered together, so one doesn't outweigh the others. It says it should not be viewed in isolation, but rather as part of the package. And that's quite an important thing to remember when we talk about principles of ESD, but also when we talk about the precautionary principle. And they go on here to say in some circumstances, you know, the precautionary principle may need to be weighed against other principles as well as human rights, like the human right to food, water, health, and shelter, and so on. And you often see that argument when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions from coal mines, this idea that we need to be providing energy sources to overseas countries, that's a human right to have access to reliable energy, and if we don't mine the coal, then we're not delivering on that human right, so it has to be balanced. So what did the court say about the role of Australian standards? So they said the Australian standard is an authoritative and scientifically credible standard to protect the health and safety of people and the environment from the harmful effects of radio frequency fields, and it's not for the court to set aside or disregard such an authoritative and scientifically credible standard. Nor is it appropriate for the court to pioneer standards of its own. The creation of new standards is the responsibility of other authorities with special expertise, and so they came to the conclusion that the job of the court and the job of the council was to accept the Australian standard and to apply it to decide whether or not there was any risk from the project. And then, in fact, they went on to say that the standard itself had a precautionary approach embedded in it. And they'd gotten experts who had shown that the exposure limits that they had used were very conservative, there were margins for safety, and they had based their reference levels on worst-case assumptions. And then they went on to say that Telstra itself had said that their proposal for where they were going to place the facility had a precautionary approach adopted in it as well in terms of the nature and the design of the antennas, their tilt and pan, the nature and quality of the radio equipment, and the use of adaptive power control, all intended to minimise the radio frequency exposure. And so the court came to the conclusion that the design of the base station met a precautionary approach in any case, and so there was no need to take it further. And they pointed out, if you look at the third dot point here, community concerns have to be objectively assessed. They need to have a rational or justified foundation. And in this case, there was no probative evidence on which to make findings of adverse effects on the amenity of the locality and the health and safety of persons in the locality. And so really, this was just a campaign that had gathered a great deal of momentum, but it wasn't necessarily based on the most accurate scientific evidence. We often see very similar sort of community objections when we talk about wind farm projects. Same sort of thing, great deal of movement, great deal of local opposition. There's a lot of noise and vibration impacts, as well as visual disturbances. And we also, of course, have got the risk of bird and bat strikes. And quite often what you find is that local groups, local landholders will object to the wind farms on the basis of the environmental impacts on the birds and the bats and so on. But actually their main reason for bringing the objection is the aesthetic impacts and the impacts on local property prices and just the whole not in my backyard kind of mentality. The way that the role of ecologically sustainable development, those principles, required the decision maker consider all of the environmental, economic and social impacts, both the positive and the negative, the short term and the long term. And that means they have to balance up the short-term environmental impacts against the long-term benefits of having a renewable energy source rather than a fossil fuel energy source. And in some states in Australia, we actually have special clauses that tell decision makers to only consider the positive impacts to try and help more wind farms be approved across Australia, because quite often they run into problems at the development stage when the local council just says, well, no, we're concerned about the noise and the visual impacts on locals. But of course, the case hasn't been helped with the Prime Minister's recent barrage of criticism in the media, where he's been questioning the reliability of wind supply as an alternative to fossil fuels and blaming the South Australian government for having too much renewable energy in its power supply, and says that that is putting the whole of Australia's power reliability or reliability of power supply and power systems into question, because they're putting too much power from wind farms into the system. So we'll have to watch and see how that plays out over the next few years. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the Paradise Dam case study, and that will be the final part that we'll do for the lecture today. This is one of those fascinating cases where they attempted to challenge the project when it was approved, and successfully had a number of conditions of approval included in the final approval, including things that required them to put in place measures to protect the lungfish. And this is the Australian lungfish here. It's not the most attractive creature in the world. You know, it's much harder to launch a campaign for a rather unattractive creature like that, but they're quite limited in their distribution, and the dam was going right in the middle of the river that they had their limited distribution up and down, and so that was the main reason why the challenge was brought. So if you have a look, the red line is the core lungfish distribution, and then the yellow line is the limit of the lungfish distribution, and then Paradise Dam is midway up the core lungfish distribution. And the lungfish travels upstream and then it travels downstream, and what was going to be right in the middle of its path? A blooming great dam. So in this case, we'll have a look at the measures that the court and the regulator put in place to deal with the issues, and obviously we'll look at whether or not it was a success. You need to know that the minister can impose conditions of approval. So under the EPBC Act, it's a much broader power to impose conditions of approval. So they can impose a condition if they consider that it's necessary or convenient for protecting any matter under the EPBC Act, or for repairing or mitigating damage to any matter protected under the EPBC Act. So very, very broad powers, very different to what we see under, for example, the Sustainable Planning Act, where it's quite a narrow scope of things and they have to meet those tests. What type of conditions can be imposed under the EPBC Act? They can tell them to take specific protection measures. They can ask for financial contributions or for bonds and cash deposits, so that if environmental harm is caused, they can go and pull on that money to try and fix things. They can make them provide insurance against any liabilities that they might incur. They can require them to undertake independent environmental audits, and that's quite common. So it's this idea of outsourcing the cost of monitoring them. So they have to pay for that auditing themselves, rather than the government having to pay for staff to audit them and make sure that they're complying. They have to prepare and submit environmental management plans. There might be a condition saying they have to comply with industry codes of practice, or that they have to undertake ongoing monitoring or testing. That's very, very common. And in fact, that monitoring and testing, that's how they've caught out the Abbott Point terminal discharge. You might have seen, I put a further note up on the relevant news stories. So it turns out that that coal-laden discharge passed through one of the Abbott Point terminal monitoring facilities on its way out to the wetlands. And so there's official data showing that it's significantly larger than what was authorised under their emergency emissions licence. And so they had to notify the environmental department that they'd exceeded the temporary emissions licence, and the department is now deciding what enforcement action to take against them. So those sort of things, particularly the independent auditing and the monitoring and testing, they're just a way of trying to maintain a certain level of environmental standard, given the limited resources that we see coming from the environmental departments. Who can challenge? Well, the EPBC Act talks about these things known as interested persons. So an interested person under the EPBC Act is someone who is an individual. They have to be an Australian citizen or an ordinary resident, either whose interests are going to be affected by the proposal, or someone who's been engaging in activities for the protection or conservation of research for at least 2 years. If so, they can go and make an application for an injunction, or they can bring an appeal to challenge the decision. So we looked at Carol Booth last week. She was someone who had been actively researching in the area, and so she used that to apply to be an interested person to challenge those terrible electrocutions that were happening to the flying foxes. Organisations can also apply, same concept. They need to have had the objects or purposes of the organisation be for the protection or conservation of the environment, and they have to be engaged in activities related to the protection or conservation of the environment, and so on and so forth. We've seen real stress here in terms of the federal government looking at cracking down on what they call vigilante green groups. They're blaming those interested person clauses under the EPBC Act as being too broad and allowing too many people to challenge, particularly the mining cases. The Adani case is the main reason why the Commonwealth has been looking at this. And they're just arguing they're too broad, so it's constantly on the radar of the federal government to crack down and limit the ability of third parties to come in and challenge on the basis of environmental risk from the project. But of course that then defeats the whole purpose of the EPBC Act. The EPBC Act is designed to have third party public notice provisions, really. So it's publicly notified, submissions are made, and then there's ability to challenge decisions to make sure that all of the risks to the environment are properly ventilated and properly discussed and analysed before those final conditions of approval are put on. And of course, sometimes those third-party objections mean that the project's not approved at all. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But in this case, the objection itself wasn't successful. The project was approved, and it was approved with this condition that required them to put in place a hoist, basically, to allow for a fishway. So what you can see here is there's the spillway, and you've got an entrance coming in from the water to allow the fish to go downstream, and then there is a lift that moves up, a hoist that hoists the fish up the river. So one way of the fishway helps them go down, and one way helps them go up. I almost don't need to go on for you to realise that this was going to be problematic. I think all of you can realise, just using straight common sense, that there were going to be difficulties in designing this. Okay, here's one. Can you see where the entrance to the fishway is relative to the water? It's funny until I show you the images later. But it's funny, and I agree it's funny. When I first saw it, I had a good cackle. But I actually find some of these images really distressing as well. So it got worse because the drought got worse. So the water kept dropping, and by the time the court went out for a site visit, that's how low the water had dropped, and that's how high the entrance to the spillway was for the lungfish to allow them to get up and downstream. So this is an example of how it's meant to work. You know, you can see, doesn't it look great on paper? Highly technical, fabulous. This is it from the other side. So can you see the slide? So that's for the hoist. So the hoist starts at the bottom and hoists them up to the top. That's that orange thing that the fish are meant to happily swim into and make their way up the wall. That's it there. You might notice, if you look closely, that there's a grid on the top. Can you see the grid? It's like a cage that's just propped on the top. That was new. That had to be put in when they realised the fish were jumping out halfway up the wall and falling to their death on the concrete below. So it wasn't particularly well designed from the get-go. But anyway, here it is. So here it is. This is it at the bottom of the dam wall. It's completely dry. It's not in use. Bottom of the door is open. And it was like this for most of the time. So it kept having faults, and it kept needing to be repaired, and there it is not working. So this is it near the top. This is what it sort of should look like. You can see it's got water inside, fish swim in, la la la. Grid on top so they don't jump out. So the idea was that they'd swim happily into the hoist. The hoist would lift them up, and then it would deposit them into the water on the other side, okay? And then the downstream one, they would happily swim into this small concrete channel, and then that would move them rapidly downhill, and they would come out at the other side. Two issues that they found was, one, the fish falling out of the hopper as it went up the hill, and the other one was the lungfish didn't really want to swim into a dark concrete tunnel. And were on top of that, and I don't know, one of these images we'll get to, and I'll show you another problem that happened that was not the fault of the designers. We'll get to it in a minute. But there was another reason why they didn't want to swim into those holes either. So this is it from the outside. You can see even from here, it's in disrepair. It's not fully working. This is the spillway. So the water's going to come off the top of the dam when it overflows, so during heavy rain or when there's releases, the water comes over the top of the spillway and cascades down those steps. The cascading effect is meant to slow down the motion. It's a control measure. It was not in any way designed to assume that there would be fish coming down with the overflow. This is what happened during the March 2010 floods. it overflowed, it spilled. And with that water came the lungfish. And they were being hit on those steps as they came down. You can see there's a YouTube video there if you want to look at it in your own time. You can see it was absolutely full force water coming down over those steps and then down into the river. And there was a report. There was an investigation into this. This is in February 2012. This report was released. So this was a government department report looking at the large number of fish that were injured and died as a result of falling onto that as the water cascaded out of the dam. So it says the data indicates that the Queensland lungfish were being injured and killed during their passage over the dam wall during the high and the low flows over the spillway. And this is a living fish, severely injured, and that the government monitoring agencies went out and they sort of were capturing the fish. You can see that's where it's hit the stairs on the way down. It's been quite badly injured. And it says that there was video recorded of the fish passing over the spillway wall, striking the wall surface, being projected into the air before striking the wall again. All of the eels in this case that were retrieved had obvious strike injuries and were deceased when they were collected. So the long-finned eels were killed entirely, and then larger fish species such as lungfish, golden perch and barramundi exhibited localised injuries consistent with striking hard objects. Injuries were extensive and obvious and consisted of abrasions, descaling and head damage. It says, for example, see figure 28. This one's deceased, and you can see the strike mark from where it's hit the dam. So they did, the report talks about how many mortalities they sampled just in the time following those releases in March and September 2010. You can see the lungfish, we've got 152 there, and then many other types of species as well. And those were the spillway mortalities, and then there were mortalities from the environmental tower as well. This one's alive but has severe injuries after making its way through the environmental tower. This one has a broken spine. This is really gross. So they were releasing water through the environmental tower, so they were sucking it in, and the fish were being sucked through the grid at the same time. Okay, so how did we end up here? How did we end up with that happening, and that happening under approval, if you like? So obviously they needed approvals. They needed approvals to construct something in the river, so to construct the dam in the river. They needed approvals to control river flow. They needed approvals to extract water from watercourses. So there were many pieces of legislation that applied here. The EPBC Act was one of them, but obviously the Water Act would apply to things like this as well. It was assessed and it was approved under all state and federal laws. It underwent a full EIS under the State Development Public Works Operations Act. Okay, so that's just to remind you of the EIS process under the SDPWOA, and all of that was complied with. So this was all, above board. They gave them a condition of approval, and the condition of approval said Burnett Water must install a fish transfer device on the Burnett River Dam that's suitable for the lungfish. The fishway will commence when the dam becomes operational. So they had to install it, it had to be suitable for the lungfish, and it had to commence operation when the dam became operational. So those are the three components that they had to meet in that condition. So it was a well-drafted condition. They thought of everything. And that's really the input of the conservation groups there that had this condition included. How does the analysis of the impacts add up after all these years? So this is showing a 6-year operation. So it goes from November 2005 to November 2011. It shows the percentage of time each month that the fishways operated. The downstream fishway is the red line. The upstream fishway is the blue line. Anywhere it's flatlining means it's not operational. So that's the amount of time it was operational across that 6-year period. You can see, even at the very beginning there, from November 2005 through to January 2009, the downstream fishway was not operational. From January 2006 through to January 2008, it was operational less than 20% of the time. And it goes on like that. It had periods where they would fix it, and then it would break down again. And it would be a long period of being either partially operational, faulty, or just straight out just not working at all. What's the impact of the failure to operate the fishways for extended periods? Well, obviously, one of the things I'm highlighting here is the importance of monitoring requirements. So what they found in a report in 2008 is that lungfish were actually being prevented from moving upstream and downstream because the fishway in the middle at Paradise Dam wasn't operating as it was required to under the condition of approval. So the Department of Fisheries tagged the lungfish and traced them as they made their way upstream and downstream. And what they had was antennas on them. So the antenna would detect the fish as they approached the dam wall, and another antenna would detect the fish as they passed over the dam wall. Another one would detect them as they approached the upstream fishway, and then another one would detect them as they moved downstream or returned upstream from the dam wall. So there was quite a comprehensive system of monitoring the movement of the tagged fish. This was done by the government, not by the operator of the dam. And you can see what they're showing here is the movement of the lungfish between August 2007 and September 2008. During this time, the downstream fishway was inoperable due to water levels in the dam reservoir being beneath the entrance. I showed you how water's down here, entrance is up there, problem. So what happened is, what you can see here is the fish come up to the dam wall, they turn around, they go back again. They come up to the dam wall, they turn around, they go back again. They come up to the dam wall, they turn around, they go back again. And they were showing that this was happening. So they were moving 30 kilometres upstream, coming back up to the dam wall again, moving back up and doing that over and over again, still looking for ways to get through the dam. So, we've had some very major impacts from the dam. Obviously they had to destruct and flood 40 kilometres of river to make the dam wall and the reservoir, major changes in the downstream flow regime, major barrier to fish passage up and downstream, and we've got fish mortalities from that stepped spillway in terms of them being injured during releases. Ironically, this fishway was not done on the cheap. I think this, for me, is probably the most outrageous part of it. They say that the downstream fishway cost about $8 million. The upstream fishway cost about $12 million. The operating costs are probably more than $100,000 a year, and it's still not operating. So, all of that money was thrown at it because it looked like a good design, perhaps. We ended up with something that didn't deliver any real mitigation effect in terms of the impacts on the lungfish. So the environmental groups brought a federal court case alleging breach of that condition. They said that Burnett Water had not complied with that condition of approval, and the court dismissed that application. They brought these cases across 2008 to 2011, so they tried quite a few times, and the court dismissed it and said that that Burnett Water had taken reasonable efforts, reasonable steps to comply, and that in itself was sufficient. But if you want to see anything more about it, you can look on Chris McGrath's webpage there. He's got a case study on the Paradise Dam. So that's all we need to cover about the EPBC Act, yeah. Yeah, and you and I would say, yeah, for a significant portion of time, it did not comply. The difficulty is that when they get before the courts, the court is balancing all sorts of things, and the court would have taken into account how much money they were throwing at it. The fact that they had spent so much money on designing and installing, and that they had, you know, evidence of specialists coming in to look at the faults and to try and address it, and there was no easy solution, and, you know, the drought was part of the problem, and then the floods were part of the problem, and then, you know. But certainly for anyone else looking at it objectively, it seems very clear that that condition was not complied with, and that steps should have been taken to enforce compliance with it. And I think it's incredibly sad when you see the damage that it's caused. You know, it's anyone could have thought about that. You know, anyone would know that in cases of flood, releases occur from the dam. I'll just answer this one down here, and then I'll ask you. Yeah.
So just back to the Franklin Dam.
Yes.
Or not Franklin Dam. Considering that the Commonwealth 6-year remaking legislation to make sure that they weren't able to repair that dam, why isn't there not more Commonwealth influence over the Great Barrier Reef as such, given that there's so much environmental degradation there that it's quite clear, but there doesn't seem to be much support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for people listening at home, the great question I've just been asked is, why are we not seeing more Commonwealth involvement to use the EPBC Act and all of the broad range of powers that the Commonwealth has to protect environmental matters, including the Great Barrier Reef? And it's a fabulous question. And when I answer that question, I mean, the easiest answer is it was the Hawke government. It was a Hawke government who, you know, was lovely. He was pro-green. And it was a green government in federal power, and it was a non-green government in control in Tasmania. And we haven't really seen that since. And what we have seen is some prime ministers attempting to be more ambitious about environmental targets, and their political positions are not stable enough for them to ride out the opposition from the other members of their parties. One of the things, there was a report released, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's a report that calls on environmental governance in Australia to be redesigned. And what it's saying is we need an independent Commonwealth environmental body that is separate from these Commonwealth departments and is able to exercise the powers of the EPBC Act and you know, in an ideal world, broader powers to control and regulate and advise on environmental matters across Australia. That the current Commonwealth governments are too closely entrenched in the political preferences of the government, and they haven't got enough independence, and that's what we need. We need more independence, and we need stronger Commonwealth legislation. But a lot of people would disagree with that and say, you know, if we look at what's happening at the moment, some of the best environmental outcomes that we're seeing are from the states of Victoria and the ACT and South Australia, who are going it alone and just ignoring the Commonwealth and saying, we don't actually care what your renewable energy target is. We don't care what your view is on climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to go carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to have 50% renewable energies by 2030. And they're just ignoring the Commonwealth and saying, well, let's just set our own standards. And if we then give this strong power to a Commonwealth body, what does that do to the innovation and the progress that we're seeing at a state level? So it's actually a really tricky question. And the environmental sort of legal researchers seem to be divided. Some are on one side and some are on the other. I've always had a strong view that we should be centralising. But I can also see that so much has happened recently and all of the good stuff has been at state levels. And if we centralise, do we just lose all that wonderful innovation that we're seeing? So yeah, it's a good question and it's a tricky answer. Mm. Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. So one of the things that the federal government keeps saying at the moment is that Australia is an emissions-intensive economy, that we have a wealth of natural assets, being fossil fuels, so gas and coal, and that we should fully exploit those natural assets that we have in Australia because it will benefit us socially, economically, and so on. And so that's why we see this pattern at a Commonwealth and a local level of approving these mining projects, because it's benefiting Queensland, it's benefiting the Commonwealth, you know, under that mentality of if we exploit all our resources, then we're all benefiting. But a hydroelectric scheme, these subsidies would have just gone straight to the state government. It's different. We're not seeing a series of royalties over the course of the hydroelectric power. So yeah, I think that's very true. What was the question up the back? Yeah. Big voice. Oh, the Commonwealth government. Ah, that's an interesting question. Do you think as step-in powers or from the very beginning? Mm. To fix it? That's a fascinating question. So the question is, when the government, the Commonwealth, let's say, realised that the fishway wasn't working and that nothing was being done to fix it and the lungfish were being damaged, and obviously our lungfish are listed under the EPBC, so we've got this whole duty of care coming up. Should the Commonwealth have done something about it? Should they have used their resources and assets to step in and fix things? I love that question so much. The answer is just, it's all about property. And it's all about who owns the property, and they would not be allowed access onto the site. They would not be allowed to interfere in someone else's property. There's like such a strong limit on what the environmental organisations are allowed to do. But it is a really interesting question of, you know, whether or not at the very beginning Burnett Water did not have the necessary expertise to pick the right fishway and put it in, and whether in fact there should have been a third party like a conservation group or something like that, or even a university researcher that was used to select the right device, monitor it, modify it, and actually perhaps they didn't go to the right place to begin with. And once that money had been spent, and we are talking about multiple millions of dollars, it was very hard then to make, you know, more difficult for the court to go back and say, no, you haven't taken steps to comply. My personal feeling is the mistakes were made right at the beginning when they chose the wrong design for the wrong fishway. Yeah, very good question. Any others? No? Wonderful. Thanks for coming, everyone, and I will see you next week when we talk about climate change, if I remember correctly. Pretty sure it's climate change next week. Hello, how are you doing? Yeah, good. Yeah, let me just turn the recording off.